This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Jovanni, Shiloh, Manisha, and Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Henry. Thanks for joining us today. With me is my co-host, Jovanni. Jovanni, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Henry. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Excited for this interview.
October 7th marked the first anniversary of the Palestinian Holocaust. Israel's extreme reaction to October 7th has galvanized the world and created a sea shift in global public opinion against the Zionist state and solidarity with Palestine. This is the first genocide in history that is live streamed, with the genociders posting their crimes on social media and Israeli leadership openly talking about their genocidal intent. No one with access to a smartphone can claim they don't know. Students, activists, and average people from all walks of life have mounted almost daily protests and demonstrations across the globe for a ceasefire and justice for Palestinians. Even though most Western governments have taken repressive actions as criminalizing Palestinian advocacy, yet many people refuse to be intimidated and continue to organize. One of these people are here with us today, Dr. Sara Masoud. I had the opportunity to attend a film screening she organized, followed by a vigil at a nearby park. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's introduce Dr. Masoud. She's an organizer with San Antonio Justice for Palestine and has been active there since she moved to San Antonio in 2018. She's an assistant professor at UT Health San Antonio, where she does community-engaged research about dementia. Masoud is also a faculty advisor for the healthcare workers for Palestinian student organizations at UTH San Antonio. She is from the Palestinian diaspora and has visited Palestine twice in the last 2 years, before and after October 7th. Welcome to the show, Dr. Masoud. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. Really excited for our conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a year since the Israeli onslaught on Palestinians. Now it's extended to Lebanon, and there's no end in sight, right? I just keep escalating. Now it looks like it's escalating towards Iran. What are your reflections on that?
I think my first reflection would be that has been a year since a significant escalation in their onslaught. This is not new in some ways to the Palestinian experience, but in many ways, it's not new. There have been several sieges on Gaza since the occupation began, even before 1948. But if we're starting time somewhere, as far as the establishment of the state of Israel and the Nakba, the great catastrophe, since 2006, after the withdrawal of the Israeli settlements from Gaza, Gaza has remained under the violent oppression of the state of Israel. New in terms of the dynamics, the severity, the length of time, the live streaming of the genocide, this world's consciousness of it is new. But as far as the operation of genocide, down a long line of different iterations of this genocide. My family is from the West Bank. We're from a village called Burka, north of Nablus. There are two Burkas, and we're from the West Bank. It sits with us in a very heartbreaking way. Yeah.
I remember one of the first interactions I've had with you was you were showing us the different clothing that distinguish different parts of Palestine. So for people not following the situation in Palestine, can you give us a brief history of Palestinian-Israeli relations? What is Israel? How did it start? How did it become one thing? What is Palestine? And I asked you that for a reason, because I grew up in a Catholic church, right? And my mother was very involved in the Catholic church. And I was even a monaguillo in Spanish, for how to say, an altar boy in English, right? I was an altar boy. I was very involved as well, growing up. These Sunday schools that would have the big giant maps of the ancient world. And in the giant map of the ancient world, they had cities like Damascus, Corinthians, and they had Palestine there. In the classes, we would talk about Palestine and Israelites interchangeably, like it was just one entity. I remember growing in school. Can you give us a brief history of what it means and those two names?
Yeah, I can give a brief history. It's so complex, and I can point to some resources for anyone who wants to learn more in depth, because it is a beautiful history about the people of that region of the world. Palestine has existed as an extremely long time, a place where people of all different faiths have lived. Palestine is a predominantly Muslim history, but Christians and Jews have existed on the land of Palestine for as long as those religions have existed. I think there is a deep tradition of multi-faith living cooperatively and in harmony with each other. The State of Israel is a Zionist project, believing that the Jewish people have to establish a state for Jews. Israel, a state that was established in the name of a homeland for the Jews. You often hear people say Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land, which we know is not true. People of all faiths have existed there for as long as people have existed. Although the history of Zionism extends into the 1800s, the creation of the State of Israel happened before World War II, but really went into effect after World War II, where the State of Israel was established under the precipice of creating a place for Jews to live. And so what's happened now, what we understand as the State of Israel, is a place that was violently established in May 15th, 1948, through the violent displacement of indigenous people of that land, Palestinians, who were displaced en masse to other parts into the land that we know as Gaza and the West Bank, but also into Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. Massive displacement, also mass genocide of Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians murdered through the establishment of the initial State of Israel in 1948. And since then, Arabs who live in State of Israel live as second-class citizens, are not granted the same right as a Jew living in the State of Israel. The Palestinians who still live on what we know as Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza, and even in Jerusalem, are living under a different court of law. So they're tried under martial law, which is, just to paint a very brief picture, this shows the apartheid system that has calcified into place as the existence of Palestinians and Israelis. When people try to paint this as a religious conflict, it really is not necessarily true. Judaism plays a role in the mission of the State of Israel, but the idea that Muslims and Jews refuse to cohabitate is simply false. Many Jews will tell you that the State of Israel doesn't represent Jewish values. The State of Israel is an anti-Semitic project. If you trace back the history of Zionism, the first to dissent and oppose the establishment of the State of Israel, it was anti-Zionist Jews who were saying that we can't steal land and commit genocide in the name of the establishment of an ethno state. I'll just pause there and see if you feel like that was sufficient, Jovanni. It's like a brief primer.
Yes, my understanding is it started as a violent project, started in England, in the UK, and imposed on the people of the region. You say the mass displacement of about 700,000 people, 15,000 people killed, people being spread out, and the ideology of Zionism. A guest here a few episodes ago, Israeli Canadian, and she grew up in Israel, and took her coming to Canada to see Palestinians, actually. One of the things that she said in our interview is that Judaism is a 4,000-year-old religion, and the Zionists just hijacked it, which is almost like, it's not even 200 years old ideology. I've heard Israel described as a modern state with an 18th or 19th century ideology. Go ahead, Henry, you want to jump in?
I've been spending a lot of time lately reading about Zionism, how it began, how it spread. You referenced this just a minute ago about how folks in the United Kingdom used their own native anti-Semitism to provide backing for this creation of this land. These hate-filled people that hated ethnic Jews for all their own reasons use that hatred to create an ethno-state, a state that by definition, by creation, cannot create equality for Palestinians, because the entire basis of the state rests on the notion that Palestinians are lesser than, that they use different roads, that they have to go through umpteen checkpoints to and from work and lots of other places, that to actually access medical care or an education is entirely on the Zionist state. They don't have any real control over their lives in that way. The one thing I did want to mention right now, and it'll make sense once I explain it, that I've been reading this new book called Visualizing Palestine. And it's so great. I see Sarah nodding. It's helped me so much because I really am a visual learner. It's interesting to see these ideas take forms on the map. Okay, can you guys see it? So we have what was 1918 Palestine, and this is where the black areas are where Zionists had already come and trying to force people off their land. This is 1947, just prior to the Nakba, and it shows where they had taken space there. We then get to 1960. Modern Gaza is right down here, and then over here where the West Bank would be. But you see just swallowing up all the available place. And this is one of the things that angered me so much, the use of the word Arab to describe Palestinians as opposed to Palestinian. Sarah, you're talking about land for a people without a land, and that wasn't true in the least. The desert blooming was already blooming. There had been Palestinians living there for thousands of years. Anyways, I wanted to throw out there about visualizing Palestine. It's been such a great help for me in trying to learn that kind of stuff. If anybody is listening and they're really new to the subject, it's a really great book to pick up. Jovanni, jump back in here.
So one of the things that is not talked about, I will argue that the term ethno-state is not a correct term, given that Judaism is religion, is not an ethnicity. By calling it an ethno-state and pretty much with those European Jews that came to colonize the area, but what's neglected here, the Palestinian Jews that were already living there. There were Palestinian Jews living there already. A lot of the Arab Jews that make up Israel today are from the area, from Yemen, Jewish Yemenis from Iraq. Iraq had one of the largest Jewish population in the Gulf. The Syrian Jews, so they were already living there before the European Zionists to the area. Expand on that?
I do think that you articulated it well. The narrative that there were no Jews and there were no people on this land, a very convenient narrative. We've heard it used before. We talk about this land as something that was discovered and very conveniently eliminate thousands of years of history of people who were here before. So I think it's just a very convenient narrative. I think Henry, or whichever one of you shared about the Israeli who saw Palestinians for the first time, this is something I've heard of. There's a brainwashing of Israelis, second, third, fourth generation, who are taught not to see Palestinians. I'm not sure what they think the wall does, what they think those caterpillar machines are doing. But there is this disconnect. In my experience, I went to the 48 lands for the first time in my life. I had been to Palestine. I had never crossed over into what is called Israel. And so that was the first time I had ever been able to do that was last year. But for people who are new to this topic, what it looks like to be a Palestinian trying to navigate Israel. I have a U.S. citizenship. My father, though, he has a Palestinian ID and is a U.S. citizen. So our family, although we were able to stay, my grandma had been displaced and she was 9 years old when Israel was created. She was displaced to our village where she married my grandfather. We have lineage in our village on my paternal side. My family was economically displaced as a consequence of the occupation and the lack of resources, the lack of ability to earn a living, economic displacement to Kuwait. My father mostly grew up in Kuwait. My father's a Palestinian, and we decided to try to go to 48 lands for the first time, and we were going to enter through Jerusalem and travel through 48. As a Palestinian, my father had to enter from a different checkpoint. We have U.S. citizenship, but no Palestinian IDs. My father has U.S. citizenship, but does have a Palestinian ID. That difference meant my father had to travel through a different checkpoint. We would have to drop him off. He would go by foot. We would stay in our cab. We were able to cross over after them looking over our visas, looking over IDs, a humiliating process just as a U.S. citizen with Palestinian descent. My father has to go through a much more taxing process. So we get to the other side before him. We have to drive all the way to the Palestinian entry point to pick him up. And then it's a series of mistreatment, not only from the soldiers, but from the Israelis themselves who hate Palestinians and to view us as the enemy, even though we have ancestral ties to the land. We were in my grandmother's hometown that she was displaced from it as a 9-year-old. And that is where Israelis would spit at our feet and make fun of us. We're just really antagonistic. And you have all these indicators of, as an American who doesn't really understand the history of this land, the ignorance of the Western perspective that's been fed a lot of propaganda. If you were to go to Palestine, you would potentially feel uncomfortable. There's all these signs that the Israelis put up, caution, to make it seem like there are savages living in the West Bank. You have all the indicators of prosperity when you enter 48 Rand. They're really nice paved roads. You can see the infrastructure. Even the trash cans look cleaner. You don't smell the garbage trucks that are driving up hills. The gas smells different. It looks more westernized. I can see how this lie just continues to perpetuate of the Palestinians who are these primitive savages who just are constantly erupting in random acts of violence rather than it being tethered into a narrative that should be told of like land theft and the structural violence of the occupation. So we managed, my father, for the first time in his life, at 61 years old, was able to swim in the oceans of Palestine for the first time ever on that trip. This surreal experience that we had. And the last thing I'll say, because piggybacking off what Henry said and what you shared, you spoke with an Israeli who moved to Canada and who's like, I'm seeing Palestinians for the first time. And we're hearing this more and more from Israelis, third, fourth generation Israelis who are relating to it the way we relate to being born on U.S. land. This was violently stolen, and it's our obligation to relate to it in a certain way. As Palestinians, how do we relate to Israelis who were born in the state of Israel, who are not necessarily representative? They're different from the settlers who moved there to steal land. This is where they were born. This is what they know, and what is their obligation in the fight to free Palestine, right? So an interesting period of time, and I wanted to comment on what y'all shared. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
She's working on her doctorate degree, and that's what she's talking about in her dissertation, how to invisibilize people. We have a common friend from the same organization. He gives a story. He was deployed to Iraq during the height of the war, the invasion. He was a truck driver, part of what we call the pack. He tells a story that he arrived to a camp with a log pack with the supplies, got there late at night. The next morning, they were supposed to go to the next camp, the supplies, and then go on to the next camp. So he slept in his truck. And what woke him up was sounds of a guy grunting outside right near his truck. He looks out the window, and he recognized one of them who went to boot camp with him. He was a Marine. He went to boot camp with him. And they, hey, so how you doing? Are you here too? And start talking, catch up. Yeah, tough for a good few minutes. Then he had to go because he had to deliver his supply to the next base for the next fob. The story that as he was driving away and he just moving, just suddenly hit him that his friend and the other guys there were beating up an Iraqi guy. All right. They're beating up an Iraqi guy, but at the moment he didn't see the Iraqi person. He just saw his friend there and he just started having a conversation. And to him, the Iraqi person that was getting beat up was invisible to him. Do you have anything to add to that, Henry?
I didn't have any similar experience like that, but the ease at which dehumanization props in for folks in those situations. I did 2 tours in Iraq. In my second tour, I was in Western Iraq, in Al Anbar, where based upon how the U.S. military had divided up the branches for the occupation of Iraq, it was the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps was in charge of that whole section of Iraq. I'm a soldier. I was an MP, and my MP squad got attached to a battalion of Marines. We didn't have to act like Marines or do Marine-specific missions. We mostly did our own thing. But you could see it, and it was a quiet time. There wasn't a whole lot of bad stuff going on. But before we had gotten there, I got there in mid-07 after Petraeus, shortly after the surge, and after David Petraeus had met with the Sunnis and there had been that reduction of violence. But before I had gotten there, and you could tell this by the people that we talked to, the Marines had just pounded those areas, had inundated people with patrols, airstrikes, and flyovers, even talking to the Iraqi police, even with no combat, nobody's getting hurt or anything. The Marines are still driving everyone insane. One thing I remember, and it was weird, was we helped them participate in a census of a particular area. And so that meant that 5 of us, it was myself, the one soldier, and then 4 other Marines, we went from house to house in a specific section. It was all divided by, like we would here in the United States, divided up into zip codes in particular parts. It got to me after a while, we're going to all these people's homes and we asked them how many people are there. And I'm like, why is that important? Why is it important that you know exactly how many people are around and how old the kids are, especially when you're dealing with military age males? And it was very easy because at the time I was dealing with a lot of physical pain. I had a whole bunch of health issues. Surviving right then meant I wasn't giving empathy to anybody. I didn't have empathy to give to anybody. That's not an excuse, but looking back on it, and especially with people's homes and the way that the Marines would treat the inside courtyard where people lived, for those folks, that was a sacred space. It was a space for family. Women didn't have to wear their headdresses because it was part of their home. And then the Marines would come, snipers up high, looking down into places, destroying their privacy. There was so much that I shifted down and said, I can't, because I was in a lot of pain. I don't know how to humanize everybody because I'm having to fight so hard to survive. Even though there wasn't active fighting nearby, those people had been obliterated emotionally and psychologically by the Marines being there. Jovanni, jump in here, man.
I don't know what we said military age man. I know that Obama designated a military age man. I think it was 12 or 13 years old, and to
something like that. Earlier, Sarah, you and I were talking a little bit about Fallujah. When the 2 battles of Fallujah happened and the families were having to separate themselves from military age males, which meant leaving behind a huge chunk of your family because they want to make sure that they're not letting any of the insurgents out. So all the women and kids get to leave. They don't know what's still happening in the city. And then you have people, those guys who probably done nothing wrong, any sort. And yet they're stuck there because they fit into the bad guy, the terrorist paradigm. Jovanni.
you want to say something, Sarah?
No, I think this is really resonant with what we've seen since October 7th, with the talking points around any Palestinian child will one day become a Hamas fighter, right? And it's, first of all, that's not necessarily true. If your aim is to eliminate Hamas, at the time of this interview, we're talking the day after they killed the top leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. The genocide continues. The air strikes are still happening. The ground invasions are still active. These narratives of every Palestinian boy will become a Hamas fighter one day. So we're justified in killing them, right? So it's just the same propaganda you hear in every war machine. That is, at the end of the day, land theft. It's to expand and conquer land. Even when you've killed the leader of Hamas, Netanyahu announced they have plans to slow down this operation. In fact, Jovanni opened up by saying it continues to expand even further. These are all narratives that justify that.
The key point here is for every American to know that Israel doesn't have the ability on its own to continue this for a year. Israel's military is equipped to do quick wars, not last as long, probably a month's worth. They've lasted over a year. And we're talking about a population of about 6 million Israelis. The reason they've been able to continue and sustain this level of violence for this period of time is because of the unconditional support that the United States and its Western allies give to Israel. The United States does a delivery of munitions because Israel runs out of munitions. The second supporter militarily as far as getting munitions is Germany. And Germany is followed by either Italy or the UK. The reason Israel is able to sustain this level of life for this period of long time, the reason they're able to expand like the way they're doing is because active support of the West. Without the Western support, Israel wouldn't be able to do that. The Palestinians are not only fighting the resistance, the Israelis, the Americans, the British, the Germans, the Spaniards, the Italians, and their own Arab brothers around, surrounded by collaborators. Comprador governments in the Gulf stately say they support the Palestinians, but their actions say something different. The only entities are sharing blood with the Palestinians, which is the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Yemenis, Iranians. They're malign entities. They're malign entities in the mainstream media. They're the worst of the worst in the mainstream media in the West. Keep in mind that West is the ones facilitating and supporting this, right? But yet these entities that I just mentioned, they're the worst of the worst. I forgot the Iraqi militias. They're the worst of the worst. They're all terrorists. But if you look at Israel, the International Criminal Court of Justice designated Israel as committed genocide. I think it was the South African complaint that South Africa put on Israel that they've been committing genocide. According to the Convention Against Genocide of 1948, the international community, the world governments, they're supposed to stop the committing of genocide before it happened. And if it's actively happening, they're supposed to get involved. They're supposed to intervene to end it. So now these malign, not all of them are states, like through the states, but entities, they're doing what they're supposed to do in accordance to the Convention Against Genocide, but then they're maligned for it. They're called terrorists for doing so.
I think people are learning a hard lesson that the international organizations that are supposedly there to protect the people of the world are really in line with Western interests, right? What relevance does the ICJ ruling that Israel is likely committing a genocide, which we're like, yes, obviously they're committing a genocide. What is the consequence, right? Like you said, we're still fueling and backing. And I guess that brings us to the more local level and how you started this conversation, which is we had this vigil, we had a screening on October 6th, 2024, followed by a silent procession and a vigil. And then the next day, between the banner drops and the student organizations here in San Antonio, I often go back and forth, like many of us who we're a year in and it's just feeling worse than ever. There's this fatigue and resignation. New things can be said that haven't already been said. What levers can be pulled that haven't been pulled? We had such an active fight at the local level to push for a ceasefire, which is ultimately a symbolic gesture in and of itself. We never had any misgivings that Ron Nirenberg of San Antonio declaring a ceasefire would mean that Biden would stop arming Israel, right? We knew that it wasn't that, but what we were fighting for was more in line with our understanding that as people of the United States, it is our responsibility to build power wherever we can. And I think if we were able to move forward a ceasefire resolution, other cities could have learned from that model, learned from our approach. We're the seventh largest city in the United States. With enough power, we could have maybe seen more pressure on the Biden administration to stop fueling and funding this genocide. And so that brings us a year later as we're looking around and being like, what's left to do? What is our obligation? Constantly having to reorient yourself that one, Palestinians in Palestine will free Palestine. It is not going to be freed by those of us in the heart of the U.S. empire. Palestine will free herself, and our obligation is to deconstruct these forces of power and the backing to the best of our ability. So really leaning into now at the local level, we're trying to lean into how can we build power, ongoing commitments. One of the positive outcomes, it's hard to say that because the price tag of this has been the genocide. The Lancet report estimates back in July, 186,000 deaths. We have the Ministry of Health in Gaza reporting 42,600 today. But really, the estimates are up to 200,000 deaths. what are the health consequences long term of the people who are going to die from the chemicals, the PTSD, the lack of health infrastructure. We're looking at a massive genocide.
I'm sorry. And Sarah, and just to put things into perspective, right? 200,000 people out of a population of 2.2 million. That's almost the size of San Antonio.
Right.
Just to put things in, that's 200,000 San Antonians just perishing. Perspective. That's
And,
bigger.
and
That's bigger than a lot of towns in the United States. Go ahead.
it's interesting because people are celebrating the martyrdom of Sinwar, and it's every Palestinian is Sinwar. Every martyr should hold that much importance. Every single person who has been killed in the name of the establishment of this state should be celebrated. Our function at the local level, as a Palestinian, it's been really hard. I've had many moments over the last year of deep depression. At the personal level, I had to start antidepressants this year for the first time in my life. There is part of the experience being in the US and feeling so ill-equipped and unable to stop this genocide that you have to do this constant reminder. And that's where people like you come in, Jovanni. That's where people like Judith Norman, and the folks of San Antonio, where we can't stop building power and we can't stop leveraging that power whenever we can. That's where we say we're coming up on election season, and I have no misgivings about the power of an individual person's vote. That is so far beyond what I think will be what leads to a free Palestine. And so really trying to relate to these moments as opportunities to build community power and more leverage against these structures. So leaning into BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, local organizers trying to dismantle Valero and Caterpillar, right? Valero are the primary, if not the only provider of the form of jet fuel that is used in the aircraft carriers that are dropping the bombs. So we do have our role in the liberation of Palestine at the local level in San Antonio too. So I just wanted to make sure that was acknowledged in this conversation too.
Absolutely. It goes back to what we said earlier, that without the active support, financial, political, economical, military support that the United States gives Israel will be able to carry out what it's carrying right now. Netanyahu comes to Washington, gives a speech, and he's treated as Emperor Bibi. It's a bipartisan thing too, because we're usually these two parties are at each other's throat. But Bibi shows up, and it's like the second or third time he shows up, and he's standing ovations by both parties. So it's something that people need to realize as well. Everyone's in cahoots with this. AOC's in cahoots with this. Don't be fooled. I remember Malcolm X said, "Be careful what the media says. It'll make you hate the person who you're supposed to love and love who you're supposed to hate."
Yeah, and the propaganda machine is so powerful. In 2021, we saw a shift in the way people in the United States saw Palestine. We saw the eviction of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, where people were being forcibly displaced from their homes, vocally resisted. That resulted in a series of protests. You were there right alongside us at that protest, Jovanni, here in San Antonio. It was coming off of the murder of George Floyd, this increased political consciousness in the U.S. that was holding liberals to account for their support of the genocidal state of Israel, and people started drawing these connections. And then you have 2023 with the October 7th resistance. And like many Palestinians, so much of last year that was wasted breath on condemning Hamas. Now, if somebody's condemning Hamas at this point, you roll your eyes at them. We shouldn't necessarily dismiss the perspectives of the people of Palestine who have suffered after the resistance of October 7th. But we have to reorient ourselves that Hamas wouldn't exist and wouldn't have to resist if the state of Israel didn't first create Hamas and then create the conditions under which resistance was a necessity. So I think when we're talking about Palestine with people who are using these distracting arguments of, oh, so you support what Hamas did on October 7th? No, I don't. And we saw the Ta-Nehisi quote interviews, right? Well, it doesn't matter what I think about Hamas because I don't support genocide. Do you support genocide? And reorienting people to what this really is. It's a genocidal project. Henry, did you want to say something to that?
Been enjoying mass media doing backflips and things about that whole process. Ta-Nehisi was his book coming out at the time that it did, and how everybody responded to it has created a better understanding at a mainstream level. People throwing out, "Don't you believe that Israel has the right to exist?" I remember hearing what he said. No state exists because of individual or group rights. States exist through violence. That is how they maintain their hegemony over their borders and relationships with other folks. To make it seem like it's anything else is just a fantasy. It's just an entire fantasy. And going back to what Jovanni said, that quote from Malcolm X about learning to love who you hate and hate who you love. And that is exactly what they do. I found his responses on things, he didn't participate in the paradigm. He didn't jump into that. He didn't say anything about it. The overarching thing was just a breath of fresh air. It's certainly one point among a multitude of other horrifying ones, especially in terms of suppression of what's happening over there.
This is one of the things that you mentioned, pro-Palestinian people in the United States, they're always confronted with that question. That's one of the things I also mentioned in the position to organize, is that one thing, it's codified in international law that people under occupation, people under oppression have a right to resist, they have the right to free themselves by any means necessary. It's codified in international law. And the occupier does not have a right over the people they're occupying. The occupier has responsibilities. They have the responsibility to life, to disrupt the civilian life as little as possible under the occupation. That's their responsibility under occupation, because occupation is legal. But if you are occupying, as an occupier, you have responsibilities. You don't have a right. However, the occupier do have a right. They have a right to free themselves by any means necessary. But that's one of the narratives here in the West we need to be firm about. Every time we're told, do you condemn what Hamas did in October 7, the answer should be no. Because Hamas is a resistance, right? They're of the people, right? Just like Mao said, the revolutionary swims the sea of the people. They're part of the people from there, and they have the right to resist by any means necessary. One of the things that needs to be said about October 7 is that the Israeli government hasn't really done an investigation. But they were to do an investigation, and a lot of people have done, journalists and everything, they have a circumstantial investigation, judging by the pictures that was seen, but they haven't. And the reason they haven't is because a lot of people a lot of heads will roll if they were to do one investigation. For one thing, they keep talking about, and Kamala Harris also mentioned it, they keep talking about 100 and what is it? At the beginning, they said that October 7 is Israel's 9/11. No, it's not. Those are not. The Israelis, Yahoo said, this is the greatest violence on Jewish people since the Holocaust. No, it's not. What needs to be said is that this was a military operation by the resistance. It wasn't just Hamas. It was a coalition of factions. They conducted this operation on military targets in the Gaza envelope when they assaulted military bases. They assaulted military outposts that was there to spy on them and to keep confined Palestinians there in Gaza. Gaza is referred as a big, huge concentration camp. And those military outposts that were assaulted that was their job. The job was to contain Palestinians in Gaza. And what Hamas did was breach security walls and assaulted these outposts. They assaulted these outposts, and they had a couple missions here. One thing, they assaulted the outpost. There was one big, if you were to relate it to the American experience, it was a Little Bighorn, the Battle of Little Bighorn against Custer's army. The South IDF command was humiliated on October 7, and they abandoned their posts. They abandoned their posts when they got this assault. According to Scott Ritter, the former U.S. Marine officer and weapons inspector, he described October 7 as the most successful military raid of this century, from a guerrilla force that doesn't have the same resources as the enemy, right? That pretty much survived out of his wits and out of his own native creativity against the most armed military in the region, Israel. It was a humiliating defeat for them. And the response, they went in full force. They went in full force to respond to that, right? Hamas had a couple of missions to keep the Palestinian story alive with the new Middle East that Trump was pushing for. Just a month before that, Netanyahu was in the United Nations showing a map of the new Middle East and Israel without a Palestinian, without a Gaza, without a West Bank. You had all these governments making concessions with Israel. They were normalized. Saudi Arabia was a holdout. Saudi Arabia was a huge asset there because if Saudi Arabia was to normalize, that means they will give the green light for everybody else to normalize. And the Palestinian question would have been dead after that. So what what Hamas did was to keep the Palestinian question alive and give the idea of a bloody nose. If it bleeds, it can die, right? They're not this omnipotent entity. They haven't done an investigation yet. They keep talking about the 1,200 Israeli killed on that day as if they were all civilians, and they weren't all civilians. It was a mixture between military people and civilians involved as well. They crossfire. But the way they make it sound is just like Hamas just lined up 1,200 people against the wall and just executed them. That's not what happened. Your take.
No, and I think you brought up a good point in that calling this the worst massacre against the Jewish people since the Holocaust erases Israel's own violence to Jews of Palestine and the establishment of the state of Israel. There is ample evidence to show that many of the people who were massacred on the 7th were killed by Israelis killed by Israel. So,
exactly.
And I think we're still dealing with the consequence of the misreporting that was done on October 7th. But I also don't want to participate in conversations of October 7th and Hamas without the nuance of the Palestinian experience being in Gaza. The people of Gaza have lost. It's one thing to talk about this as Israel losing, Israel being humiliated, Hamas winning, Hamas being humiliated. Ultimately, what's happening is the people of Palestine who are trapped in Gaza are living the most horrific experiences that any of us could imagine. We just have to open our phones and see people watching their loved ones burned alive or watching their children starve to death in front of them, suffocating. I don't think people comprehend what happens to a human body, even if you are pulled out from the rubble. What happens to the human body? Your body goes into a state of shock and you can die from kidney failure because of the excretions within your body from the impact of being crushed under rubble, which is a horrifying way to die. At the end of the day, all these conversations about Hamas and political dialogue where we are constantly exhausted and engaging in conversations, do you condemn Hamas? And I think some anchoring points are always the United States is as accountable for this genocide as Israel is. There would be no genocide. Israel would not be able to commit this genocide if it weren't backed by the United States and then the other Western governments. It doesn't matter politically where we land. You don't have to have a sophisticated critique of the state to know that you don't condone genocide. Where you land on this conversation should always be, I'm going to do whatever I can to stop the existence of harm against people. Being in the United States and not being able to physically strap yourself to a bomb doesn't mean there aren't things we can do to try to dismantle the systems of power that facilitate the genocide against the Palestinian people.
Yeah, just like a local San Antonian said, Aaron Bushnell, in one of his last statement was, if you ever wondered what you would have been doing the slavery or the Jewish Holocaust or the civil rights era, you're doing it now.
So there's a lot that still needs to be done as this anniversary has come and gone. It just seems to be getting worse. It should rally us to fight harder. And we do have our role here in San Antonio, and we have a role to play in the liberation of Palestine. San Antonio for Justice in Palestine is where people who are local, if they want to get involved, should reach out.
I think it's a good place to wrap it up for today. What do you think, Henri?
Sounds good.
Thank you. I really appreciate this dialogue and how much research and investment y'all have put into having this conversation.
Dr. Masoud, thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts and experience with us. How can people support what you're doing?
San Antonio for Justice in Palestine, SAJP 1948 on Instagram. We collect funds. One of our core founding members is in Gaza, and we're able to send money to Gaza to provide food. So if people wanted to support monetarily, we can definitely receive funds on the Instagram page. People can learn how to do that or contact us. And then if people are willing to get involved in a more tangible and direct way in terms of building their capacity to be organizers at the local level, we have built out some training protocols and opportunities for people to do that. And again, the Instagram is a good way to reach us.
I'll include a link to it in our show notes so folks can find it.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you guys for being with us today. Thank you for joining us. Please subscribe. Please like us, subscribe us to our channel on YouTube, X, Telegram. Look us up wherever you listen to podcasts. Please share it with your friends. Help us grow. And stay tuned to our next episode. Thank you.
Appreciate y'all.
Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that. In addition, any support we receive makes sure we can continue to provide our main episodes free for everyone. And for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Ren Jacob, and Helge However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.